Hey guys, tonight we drift into a candlelit drawing room where the air smells faintly of beeswax, starch, and restrained hostility, where silk skirts whisper across parquet floors like they're carrying secrets of their own. You're standing just behind a velvet-backed chair, watching duchesses smile at one another with expressions so sweet they could rot your teeth, while their eyes quietly sharpen like knives. This is the Victorian world at its most polished and most dangerous, and you probably won't survive this socially if you misstep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there, because somewhere, someone else is also awake and judging. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You ease forward, careful not to disturb the scene, because this is a world where disturbance is punished not with shouting, but with exclusion, silence, and the slow death of relevance. Victorian duchesses are not allowed to openly feud. That would be vulgar, almost American. Instead, they fight the way their era demands, politely, indirectly, and with devastating patience. You feel it immediately, the tension beneath the pleasantries like static under lace gloves. These women have power, real power, but it's the kind that must pretend it doesn't exist. A mainstream historical fact anchors you here. By the mid-19th century, Britain's aristocracy still wielded immense social and political influence, even as industrial wealth began to challenge their dominance. Dukes sat in the House of Lords, controlled vast estates, and shaped elections through patronage. Their wives, the duchesses, were expected to embody grace, stability, and moral superiority. Yet behind that polished expectation was a reality historians openly acknowledge. Aristocratic women exercised influence primarily through social networks, salons, and carefully curated relationships. This was not a side stage, this was the stage. You watch a duchess laugh softly at a comment that wasn't funny. Her rival mirrors the laugh half a second later, just enough to make it seem like coincidence. It isn't. Timing matters here. Everything matters. Seating order at dinner. Who is greeted first? Who receives the longer glance? You realize quickly that these women are constantly counting, ranking, and remembering. If Victorian England had spreadsheets, these duchesses would be terrifyingly good at them. There's a quirky tidbit you might not expect. Some duchesses kept detailed personal diaries not just of their own lives, but of social slights they believed they'd suffered. These weren't always emotional venting sessions, they were strategic documents. Names, dates, perceived insults, and future opportunities for quiet revenge were all carefully noted. It's like a 19th century burn book, except written with a quill and sealed with moral superiority. You can almost hear one of them muttering, "I'll remember this," while sipping tea like nothing happened. The fighting begins early, often before anyone is officially an enemy. You notice how young women entering ducal marriages are assessed the moment they step into society. Is she wealthy? Is she fertile? Is she charming, or worse, effortlessly so? You feel the room recalibrate around a newcomer, alliances shifting subtly, like furniture rearranged in the dark. One duchess smiles wider, another stiffens just enough to be noticed by those trained to notice. And they are trained. Lifetimes of watching rooms have honed them into emotional radar systems. Historians still argue whether these rivalries were primarily personal or structural, whether duchesses genuinely disliked one another, or whether the social system forced competition so intense that friendship was nearly impossible. As you stand there, watching the careful choreography of civility, you suspect it might be both. After all, it's hard to like someone when only one of you can be closest to the Queen, or most admired at court, or remembered as the standard everyone else failed to meet. You drift closer to a cluster of women discussing a charity bazaar. On the surface, it's benevolence incarnate. Beneath it, you can feel the tension spike. Who will donate more? Who will be praised in the papers? Who will be seated next to the bishop during the luncheon? Victorian philanthropy is not just about helping the poor, it's about being seen helping the poor better than anyone else. You almost laugh at the irony. Imagine flexing your moral superiority so hard it becomes competitive. Actually, don't imagine it, you're watching it happen. A light joke slips in as you realize this entire social structure runs on the emotional equivalent of bless your heart. Everything sounds kind, supportive, and gracious, but every sentence has a second meaning hiding just behind it, sharpening itself quietly. If passive aggression were an Olympic sport, Victorian Duchesses would have taken home the gold, silver, and probably politely apologized for winning too much. You notice how even fashion plays its part this early in the conflict. One duchess wears a shade of lavender that technically follows mourning etiquette but pushes just close enough to violation to raise eyebrows. Another chooses heavier jewels than necessary for an afternoon event, a subtle reminder of wealth and lineage. Clothing is never just clothing here, it's commentary, it's punctuation, it's sometimes a full-blown insult sewn into silk. You start to understand why dressing for these events took hours. It wasn't vanity, it was armor. And here's where the danger truly settles in. These rivalries aren't loud, they don't explode, they seep. A duchess might find herself slowly excluded from invitations, her influence waning without a single argument ever occurring. One misjudged comment, one perceived slight, and suddenly doors close with smiles still on the faces behind them. You feel the chill of it, the psychological precision. This is combat where no blood is spilled, but reputations bleed out quietly over years. You catch a whispered exchange about a dinner that unfortunately couldn't accommodate everyone. The phrase lands softly, but you know what it means. Someone has been cut. And in Victorian society, to be cut is social amputation. You don't scream, you don't protest, you simply disappear from relevance. That's the fear humming under every polite exchange, the reason duchesses fight so carefully and so relentlessly. Another mainstream fact grounds you again. Queen Victoria herself set much of the tone for aristocratic behavior, valuing propriety, loyalty, and moral presentation above almost everything else. Favour at court could elevate a family's standing dramatically. Disfavour could quietly ruin it. Duchesses, therefore, were not only representing themselves or their husbands, but their entire dynastic futures. No pressure, just the weight of centuries and expectations pressing gently, constantly on your shoulders. You let yourself smile at the absurdity of it all for a moment. Grown women waging war over seating arrangements and glances until you remember what's at stake: power, legacy, survival within a rigid hierarchy that offers very few exits. Suddenly it doesn't feel funny anymore. Or maybe it does in that darkly amused way you get when you realize humans have always been like this, just with better lighting and worse corsets. As the evening drifts on, you understand something crucial. These duchesses aren't villains in a melodrama. They're products of their environment, sharpened by constraint. They fight because they're not allowed to rule openly. They scheme because direct confrontation would destroy them. In a world that demands they be perfect ornaments, they learn to weaponize perfection itself. And standing here, listening to the soft murmur of voices and the rustle of fabric, you can already sense that this quiet battlefield will only grow more treacherous. As you move deeper into their world, you stay very still. You listen. You remember who smiled first, who smiled last, and who never smiled at all. You drift onward without anyone formally inviting you, because in Victorian high society movement itself is a kind of language. You learn quickly that where you stand, who you stand near, and how long you linger All speak louder than whatever polite phrases you murmur. Tonight the conversation has shifted from pleasantries to something far more lethal. Titles. Not the big obvious ones, those are already decided, but the invisible gradations beneath them, the hairline cracks where duchesses wedge their power and pry at one another. You feel it as soon as precedence enters the room. This is not just ego, this is architecture. Victorian aristocratic hierarchy is built with obsessive precision, and duchesses live inside it like cats who know exactly which shelf is theirs. A mainstream historical fact grounds you here. Strict rules of precedence governed Victorian society, determining order at dinners, court presentations, processions, and even how names appeared in print. These rules were published, debated, and occasionally weaponized. Rank was not abstract, it was enforced daily, publicly, and relentlessly. You watch a hostess hesitate for half a breath before announcing the procession to dinner. That pause tells you everything. Two duchesses technically outrank each other depending on context, one by marriage, one by antiquity of title. The room holds its breath. Finally, a decision is made. One woman moves first. The other smiles, but the smile is thin, stretched like fabric, pulled too tight. Congratulations, you've just witnessed the opening skirmish of a campaign that might last decades. You begin to understand that these women are not just guarding pride, they're defending relevance. In a society where power is inherited and visibility equals influence. Being placed second instead of first is not symbolic, it's strategic loss. It affects who speaks to you, who listens, who assumes you matter. And Victorian duchesses are acutely aware that influence, once lost, is brutally difficult to reclaim. This is why something as mundane as who enters a room first can feel like an assassination attempt. There's a quirky tidbit that slips into your awareness like a mischievous grin. Some aristocratic families actually consulted legal experts over questions of social precedence. Yes, lawyers, over who got to walk ahead of whom. You imagine a very serious man in a waistcoat explaining with total sincerity why Lady so-and-so must precede Lady such-and-such due to a technicality involving a long-dead earl. If you ever feel your job is pointless, remember that someone once billed hours for aristocratic walking order. The duchesses know these rules better than anyone, better than their husbands often. You see them mentally calculating lineage, titles, royal favour, and obscure exceptions like chess players planning 10 moves ahead. A newly elevated duchess, wife of a man whose family was granted a dukedom relatively recently, enters the space with confidence that borders on audacity. Older duchesses clock it immediately. New money energy, but with coronets. Dangerous. Historians still argue whether these rigid hierarchies empowered aristocratic women by giving them clear social authority or trapped them in endless competition that ultimately undermined solidarity. Standing here, watching women smile while quietly resenting one another over footnotes in peerage law, you suspect the answer is uncomfortable. The system did both, simultaneously and very efficiently. You notice how the conversation subtly turns instructional. One duchess casually references how things were always done at Almack's, the legendary social assembly rooms that once dictated who was fashionable and who was finished. It sounds nostalgic. It's not. It's a reminder. Another duchess nods, then counters, with a mention of a more recent royal precedent, something Queen Victoria herself supposedly preferred. This isn't chit-chat, it's legal citation, but make it silk. A light joke flickers through your mind as you realize this is essentially Regency-era comment sections, except everyone is in corsets and no one can block anyone. Instead, they unfollow you in real life, which honestly might hurt more. You suppress a smile. Humor, your learning, is safest when internal. Precedence bleeds into language too. Titles must be spoken in the correct order with the correct emphasis. One duchess deliberately misaddresses another just slightly, just enough to create plausible deniability. Was it a mistake? Maybe. Was it forgiven? Absolutely not. You can almost hear the mental note being written, the quill scratching quietly in an imaginary ledger. You move closer to a window and overhear a whispered complaint about court presentations. Being presented at court is the ultimate seal of legitimacy, especially for younger women entering society. But even here, rank dictates timing, positioning, and visibility. One duchess recalls how her daughter was placed, unfortunately, far back, the word dripping with resentment. Another responds with sympathy that somehow feels like a victory lap. You wonder how many lifelong grudges were born under chandeliers while everyone pretended to admire the drapery. The danger of titles is that they don't just define who you are, they define who you are allowed to become. A duchess married into an ancient but financially struggling family may outrank a wealthier rival, but money still whispers loudly. The tension between old titles and new resources hums constantly. You see it in the way one woman flaunts connections while another flaunts heritage. Both are weapons, both cut. There's another mainstream fact that sharpens the scene. By the Victorian era, the aristocracy was increasingly anxious about its place in a rapidly industrializing Britain. Wealth from industry threatened traditional land-based power. Titles still mattered, but they had to matter harder. Duchesses became guardians of that relevance, policing boundaries with ferocity disguised as etiquette. This wasn't snobbery for its own sake, it was survival strategy dressed as tradition. You notice how even sympathy can be weaponized. One duchess expresses concern for another's difficult position loudly enough to be overheard. The concern is real enough to be polite, but public enough to highlight vulnerability. It's a masterclass in soft humiliation. You almost applaud, then remember, applause would be deeply inappropriate. Another light joke drifts through your head as you realize that Victorian duchesses basically invented the concept of "I'm just asking questions, except the questions are about lineage and the consequences last generations." You wonder if any of them went home at night and screamed into embroidered pillows. Probably not. That would wrinkle the fabric. As the evening progresses, you see alliances form not out of affection, but necessity. Two duchesses with closely matched rank sit together, their laughter a little too synchronized. Mutual defense pact. Across the room, a woman stands alone just a bit too long before being approached. You recognize the danger instantly. Isolation is how precedence kills you, not quickly but thoroughly. You sense that these conflicts are rarely resolved. Titles don't change often. Precedence disputes simmer, passed down like heirlooms. A slight remembered by a grandmother becomes justification for coldness toward a granddaughter. This is generational rivalry, slow-cooked over decades. You feel the weight of it, the way history presses forward without ever fully releasing its grip. Historians still argue whether Victorian women internalized these hierarchies willingly or manipulated them cynically for personal advantage. Watching a duchess correct a footman's announcement with surgical politeness, you suspect the answer varies by individual and by how much they have to lose. By the time the gathering thins, you're exhausted and you didn't even speak. That's the lesson here. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it arranges chairs, corrects names, and smiles until someone else disappears. You glance back at the room one last time and realize that what looks like elegance is actually a battlefield mapped in titles and timing. And you haven't even reached the marriages yet. You step forward, already sensing that what comes next will make this feel almost gentle by comparison. You don't reset or pause as the scene shifts, because Victorian life never gives you that courtesy. You simply find yourself leaning closer as the conversations tilt, almost imperceptibly, toward marriage. Not romance, not love. Marriage as maneuver, marriage as currency, marriage as the quiet engine, driving almost every rivalry you've already witnessed. The duchesses around you don't speak of it directly at first. They never do. Instead, they mention ages, health, estates, and prospects, each word landing like a chess piece on a polished board. You realize quickly that for a Victorian duchess, marriage is never just about herself. It's about heirs, alliances, leverage, and insurance against decline. A mainstream historical fact steadies the room. Aristocratic marriages in the Victorian era were often strategic arrangements designed to consolidate wealth, secure lineage, and maintain political influence. Love might develop later if everyone was lucky, but it was rarely the primary concern at the altar. The Duchess's role was to navigate this system flawlessly because failure echoed for generations. You hear one woman casually remark that her son is not yet settled. The tone is light, but the subtext is urgent. Another duchess responds with polite interest, filing the information away instantly. You can practically see the mental calculations begin: age, title, income, reputation, fertility history in the family. Victorian matchmaking is a brutal data exercise conducted entirely through smiles and teacups. You notice how the rivalry sharpens when daughters enter the equation. A duchess whose daughter has just been presented at court carries herself differently, more alert, more exposed. Every other duchess sees opportunity or threat, sometimes both. A favourable match could elevate one family while sidelining another. A disastrous one could stain a name for decades. You feel the pressure thicken like air before a storm, except the storm lasts years and rains judgment instead of water. There's a quirky tidbit whispered into the margins of history. Some duchesses secretly commissioned informal background checks on potential spouses using networks of servants, distant cousins, and discreet lawyers to uncover debts, affairs, or hereditary illnesses. This wasn't paranoia, it was risk management. Imagine a Victorian version of online stalking, except the stakes are your bloodline and your seating at dinner. Suddenly scrolling someone's socials doesn't seem so dramatic. You watch as one duchess subtly undermines another by praising her daughter's artistic temperament. It sounds kind, it isn't. Artistic suggests impractical, emotional, possibly unsuitable for managing an estate. The recipient smiles tightly, knowing exactly what was meant. You feel a little thrill of horror. This is assassination by adjective. Historians still argue whether aristocratic women had meaningful agency in these arrangements, or whether they were primarily instruments of patriarchal strategy. Standing here, you can see the tension clearly. Duchesses don't choose freely, but they do influence fiercely. They nudge, resist, delay, accelerate. They protect their own children with a ferocity that has nowhere obvious to go, so it coils into strategy instead. You catch a conversation about dowries, spoken as if they're merely numbers, not emotional landmines. One duchess boasts quietly about the comfortable provision she secured for her daughter. Another listens, then counters with a remark about lineage that money can't buy. Old wealth versus liquid wealth. You've seen this fight before, just without the corsets. It's the eternal debate of pedigree versus purchasing power, now served with lemon cake. A light joke drifts through your thoughts as you realize that Victorian duchesses are basically running a high-stakes dating app where every profile is curated by an entire family and rejection is never explicit, only implied through silence. Swipe left, but make it socially fatal. Marriage rivalry doesn't end at matchmaking. It extends into the marriages themselves. A duchess whose union is publicly admired becomes a benchmark others are measured against. If she produces heirs quickly, whispers follow those who don't. If her husband is attentive, sympathetic glances fall on those whose husbands are. less so. You feel the quiet cruelty of comparison seep into every corner of domestic life. Another mainstream fact anchors this tension. Fertility was considered both a duty and a marker of success for aristocratic women. Failure to produce heirs could weaken a duchess's influence dramatically, regardless of her intelligence or competence. Medical understanding was limited, blame was unevenly assigned, and sympathy was often scarce. Rival duchesses noticed everything and remembered it. You overhear a remark about delicate health aimed at a woman who has suffered multiple miscarriages. It's framed as concern. It's not. It's a reminder of vulnerability in a system that punishes weakness. You feel the sting of it, even as an observer. The Duchess in question nods graciously, absorbing the blow with practiced dignity. You wonder how many nights she lay awake staring at embroidered ceilings, calculating her own worth. Another light joke surfaces, softer this time. Victorian society really said, "Till death do us part," then quietly added, "or until someone marries better." You immediately feel bad for laughing, which is exactly how this world works, guilt and amusement braided together. You notice how alliances form through marriage as well. Two duchesses connected by a shared in-law suddenly find themselves allies, at least temporarily. Old rivalries cool, new ones spark. Marriage reshuffles the board constantly, ensuring no conflict ever truly ends. It just changes shape. You begin to understand why these women seem perpetually alert. Stability is rare, opportunity is fleeting. Historians still argue whether the pressure surrounding aristocratic marriage was more intense in the Victorian era than before, or simply more documented. Watching duchesses trade glances over teacups like generals reading maps, you suspect documentation just caught up with reality. The stakes have always been high. Now they're just better dressed. As the evening wanes, the talk shifts away from marriage, but the damage is done. Notes have been taken, judgments rendered, futures quietly nudged onto new paths. You feel the exhaustion of it, the emotional labor of constant calculation, of loving your children fiercely while knowing love alone won't protect them. You step back, aware now that marriage isn't a chapter in these rivalries, it's the spine. Everything else bends around it, and as you move forward, you sense that money, the next silent partner in this dance, is already waiting to complicate everything further. You keep listening. You always keep listening. You don't need to be told when money enters the room. You feel it. The temperature changes, conversations grow slightly more careful, and compliments start to sound heavier, as if weighed down by unspoken numbers. Victorian duchesses rarely speak directly about finances. It's considered crude, but every rivalry you've seen so far is quietly underwritten by pounds, debts, estates, and expectations. Lace may soften the edges, but money sharpens them again. A mainstream historical fact anchors you immediately. Many aristocratic families in Victorian Britain were land-rich but cash-poor, struggling to maintain vast estates as agricultural incomes declined and costs rose. Duchesses often found themselves managing households that looked magnificent on the outside, while quietly bleeding funds behind the scenes. This financial anxiety didn't stay private. It leaked into social behavior, marriage strategy, and, inevitably, rivalry. You notice how one duchess praises another's charming old house. It sounds affectionate. It's not. Old can mean decaying, expensive, impractical. Another responds by admiring her rival's modern improvements, subtly implying new money and questionable taste. You almost admire the efficiency. Why argue when you can insult someone's balance sheet with a single adjective? There's a quirky tidbit that feels almost intimate. Some duchesses kept personal account books, meticulously tracking not just household expenses, but social obligations, gifts given, favors owed, dinners hosted. These ledgers weren't just financial, they were political. Hosting too many events drained funds. Hosting too few drained influence. You imagine a woman late at night, candle guttering, trying to decide whether a future slight is worth the immediate cost of oysters. Money complicates marriage rivalries instantly. A wealthy heiress marrying into a cash-poor ducal family might secure the estate but shift the social balance inside the household. You see the tension in the way older duchesses regard younger, richer ones, with relief, envy, and suspicion all tangled together. Gratitude for the rescue, fear of being eclipsed, resentment that survival came at the price of autonomy. Historians still argue whether aristocratic women gained greater financial agency during the Victorian era, or whether they remained constrained by male control of property. Standing here, you sense the contradictions. Duchesses manage influence and strategize around money constantly, yet much of it legally isn't theirs. Power without ownership, responsibility without authority. It's enough to make anyone sharp-edged. You overhear a discussion about allowances. One duchess mentions hers casually, almost apologetically. Another counters with a breezy reference to extensive personal spending. This isn't bragging, it's positioning. Money signals freedom, freedom to host, to travel, to patronize artists and charities. Limited funds mean limited presence. And in Victorian society, absence is its own kind of failure. A light joke floats through your mind as you realize that keeping up appearances wasn't a metaphor here, it was a full-time, budget-crushing occupation. Imagine burning through modern rent money just to maintain a façade, convincing enough that no one suspects you're quietly panicking. You feel the cruelty of financial rivalry when debts enter the conversation. Never directly, of course. It comes as concern. I do hope the renovations didn't strain them. Or sympathy. Such a burden managing an estate these days. These remarks land like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of speculation outward. Debt doesn't just threaten solvency, it threatens dignity, and duchesses protect dignity like a last line of defense. Another mainstream fact deepens the tension. Divorce was extremely rare and socially catastrophic for aristocratic women in Victorian Britain. Financial dependence on marriage meant that a duchess trapped in an unhappy or imprudent union had few exits. Rival duchesses knew this. Vulnerability became gossip. Gossip became leverage. You feel the trap. Close in, velvet-lined but iron-strong. You watch one duchess host a lavish event that feels slightly overdone. Too many flowers, too much champagne. It's impressive and worrying. Is this confidence or desperation? Others notice too. Eyes flicker. Mental notes are taken. Overspending can be a flex, or it can be a warning sign. The ambiguity is the point. Another light joke sneaks in as you imagine Victorian duchesses inventing the concept of retail therapy, except instead of shoes, it's entire wings of a house, and instead of therapy, it's social survival. You smile, then feel a twinge of sympathy. None of this is light, not really. You begin to see how money fractures potential alliances. Two duchesses might share rank and temperament, but if one can afford generosity and the other can't, resentment creeps in. Invitations become imbalanced, obligations pile up unevenly, friendship buckles under the weight of expectation. It's hard to like someone who makes your limitations visible just by existing. Historians still argue whether financial strain intensified aristocratic rivalries in the 19th century or simply exposed conflicts that were already there. As you listen to careful conversations about estates and economy, you suspect exposure played a large role. When resources tighten, politeness thins. As the gathering winds down, you feel the exhaustion of constant calculation return. Every ribbon, every candle, every carriage ride home has a cost attached to it, both monetary and social. Duchesses don't just compete over wealth, they compete over the illusion of effortlessness. And maintaining that illusion is brutally expensive. You step away knowing this. Money doesn't replace titles or marriages in these rivalries. It amplifies them. It turns slights into threats and generosity into domination. And as you move forward, you can already sense the next layer pressing in, older and deeper than cash itself. Family, legacy, houses that remember every insult ever delivered. You follow the echo of that history, already bracing for what comes next. You don't have to ask whose house you're standing in, the walls tell you. Portraits line the corridors in heavy frames, eyes following you with the quiet confidence of people who have already won history once and expect to do so again. This is where rivalry deepens from personal to ancestral, where duchesses don't just fight for themselves but for families that have been feuding, competing and quietly resenting one another for centuries. You feel it immediately, the sense that you've stepped into something old, patient, and very unwilling to forget. A mainstream historical fact steadies your footing. Many British aristocratic families traced their power back hundreds of years, with estates, titles, and political influence woven tightly into national history. These houses remembered everything: marriages, betrayals, alliances, and they passed those memories down like heirlooms. When Victorian duchesses entered these families, they inherited not just jewels and obligations, but unfinished conflicts. You notice how names are spoken with particular emphasis. "She's a Cavendish," one woman says, and the word carries weight like a warning. Another replies, but she married into the Howards." And suddenly the room recalibrates. And these aren't casual references, they're signals. Family identity matters as much as personal behavior, sometimes more. You could be perfectly charming and still be distrusted because your great-grandfather backed the wrong cause 100 years ago. There's a quirky tidbit that makes this feel almost surreal. Some aristocratic households maintained private family histories that recorded not just triumphs, but perceived slights from other families. These weren't published chronicles, they were internal narratives shaping how new generations understood old enemies. Imagine growing up knowing you're expected to dislike someone you've never met because your ancestors once competed for influence at court. You don't need imagination, you're standing in it. You watch a duchess stiffen as another enters the room, the tension immediate and unmistakable. These women may have no personal grievance, but their houses do. Old competition over land, royal favour, or political alignment still hums beneath the surface. You sense that friendliness here is conditional, provisional, always subject to revision if family interest demands it. Historians still argue whether these long-standing house rivalries genuinely shaped Victorian social behaviour or whether individuals exaggerated them for their own advantage. As you observe duchesses invoking family reputation like a shield or a blade, you suspect both are true. History provides the script, but ambition decides how loudly it's read. You begin to see how these inherited conflicts complicate everything else. Marriage negotiations aren't just about compatibility or wealth, they're about whether two families can stomach one another. A match that looks perfect on paper can be torpedoed by a single ancestral grievance. You hear one duchess dismiss a proposal with a simple phrase, "We don't align." It's vague, it's devastating. A light joke flickers through your mind as you realize Victorian duchesses are essentially managing generational grudges with better furniture and worse emotional processing. Therapy would have been cheaper, but unfortunately not invented yet. You notice how alliances between houses are treated almost like treaties. When two rival families reconcile through marriage or shared interest, it's celebrated quietly but watched closely. Everyone waits for the betrayal, because in this world, reconciliation is never assumed to be permanent. It's just a pause in hostilities. Another mainstream fact deepens the stakes. Aristocratic estates were often entailed, meaning they could only pass through male heirs, reinforcing the importance of family continuity and control. Duchesses became custodians of these legacies, expected to protect not just property but reputation. Failure wasn't personal, it was dynastic. You feel the pressure of it like a hand between your shoulder blades, constantly urging you forward whether you want to move or not. You overhear a story about a duchess who dared to side publicly with a rival house during a political dispute. The consequences were swift and cold. Invitations dried up, support evaporated. The message was clear. Loyalty to your house comes before personal conviction. You shiver slightly. This is not a society that rewards independent thinking in women unless it aligns perfectly with inherited interest. Another light joke drifts in, softer and darker. Family loyalty in Victorian aristocracy makes modern group chats look chill and forgiving. Here, leaving the chat means social exile. You see how these house rivalries provide cover for personal animosity. A duchess can justify her dislike of another by citing family history, even if the real issue is jealousy or pride. It's socially acceptable resentment, sanctioned by tradition. You start to understand why these conflicts feel so durable. They're constantly being refreshed by new emotions plugged into old frameworks. Historians still argue whether Victorian aristocratic families were more divided by rivalry or unified by shared interest in preserving their class. Watching duchesses glare across inherited battle lines while still cooperating to exclude outsiders, you realize the answer is deeply ironic. They could do both at the same time, and often did. As you move through the house, the portraits seem to multiply. Men in armor, women in stiff gowns, all watching, all reminding you that nothing here is ever just between two people. Every slight echoes backward and forward through time, amplified by memory and expectation. You leave the room understanding this much. When duchesses fight, they rarely fight alone. They fight with centuries at their backs, with ancestors whispering instructions, with houses that demand loyalty even when it hurts. And as you step onward, you sense that the next battlefield won't be inside homes at all, but closer to the center of power itself, where approval is granted by a single, distant figure on a throne. You follow that pull instinctively, knowing the stakes are about to rise again. You feel the shift before anyone says it out loud. The room doesn't change, but the direction of attention does, like a compass needle quietly swinging north. Court favor has entered the conversation, and with it, the unspoken understanding that everything you've witnessed so far, titles, marriages, money, houses, ultimately bends toward one gravitational center. The crown, or more precisely, the unpredictable glow of royal approval that can warm or scorch without warning. A mainstream historical fact anchors you here. During Queen Victoria's reign, access to the royal court remained a critical source of prestige for the aristocracy. Invitations to court events, personal acknowledgement from the monarch, and even rumours of favour could elevate a duchess's standing dramatically. The Queen's preferences mattered, and everyone watched for signs. You're not just navigating society anymore, you're orbiting power. You notice how duchesses mention royal events with casual reverence. Her Majesty was particularly attentive, one says, as if commenting on the weather. Another responds with interest that's just a shade too sharp. Court favour is currency here, but unlike money, it's unstable. It can't be saved or invested. It has to be displayed subtly but convincingly before it fades. There's a quirky tidbit that slips through the cracks of formality. Queen Victoria was known to have strong personal likes and dislikes, sometimes based on relatively minor interactions. A perceived slight, an ill-timed remark, or even an unfortunate association could chill favour for years. Duchesses learned to read the monarch's moods like sailors reading clouds because storms came quickly and explanations rarely followed. You watch how rivalry tightens around this uncertainty. One duchess carefully references a recent audience, not bragging, just noting it happened. Another counters with mention of a longer-standing relationship, implying depth over novelty. This is fencing with reputations. Each remark tests whose connection is stronger, fresher, more legitimate. Historians still argue whether Queen Victoria's personal preferences significantly shaped aristocratic hierarchies or whether they merely reinforced existing structures. Standing here, watching duchesses angle their bodies toward anyone rumoured to be in favour, you suspect personal preference mattered more than anyone liked to admit. Systems pretend to be impartial. Humans never are. You feel the pressure intensify because court favour doesn't just elevate, it excludes. Being overlooked, even briefly, invites speculation. Did she offend someone? Is her husband out of step politically? Has her family fallen out of favour? Silence from the palace is louder than criticism. You notice a duchess whose name isn't mentioned at all, and that omission hangs in the air like a missing note. A light joke floats through your mind as you realise this is essentially Victorian influencer culture, except the algorithm is one woman in mourning black and the consequences involve generations of social frost. You immediately feel guilty for thinking it, which feels historically accurate. Court favour also reshapes alliances. Duchesses who might otherwise compete find themselves temporarily united by proximity to the throne. Others, sensing exclusion, form quieter coalitions. You see the strategy in real time. Proximity breeds confidence. Confidence breeds attention. Attention breeds more proximity. It's a loop, and everyone wants in. Another mainstream fact deepens the stakes. Women were excluded from formal political power, but social access to the monarch allowed aristocratic women to influence appointments, opinions, and patronage indirectly. Duchesses didn't vote, but they whispered. They hosted, they curated introductions. Court favour magnified that influence exponentially. Lose it, and your voice softened to a murmur no one strained to hear. You overhear a remark about mourning protocol. Who was invited despite the Queen's extended mourning periods? Who wasn't? Even grief becomes a metric here. Observing mourning too lightly risks offence. Observing it too strictly risks disappearance. The balance is impossible, and everyone pretends it's effortless. Another light joke drifts in, darker this time. Victorian court etiquette is like a game where the rules change silently, and losing means you're still expected to smile beautifully while it happens. You wonder how many duchesses perfected the art of gracious disappointment. Historians still argue whether access to court-empowered duchesses or made them more vulnerable to sudden reversals of fortune. Watching a woman laugh just a little too brightly at a mention of the Queen, you sense vulnerability everywhere. Favour feels like standing on polished marble in silk slippers, elegant, but one wrong step away from disaster. As the evening thins, court talk lingers. It always does. You realise something quietly unsettling. Rivalry intensifies most where outcomes are least controllable. You can manage money, you can strategize marriage, you can leverage family history, but royal favour? Oh, that's weather. And duchesses compete fiercely for shelter. You step away knowing this truth settles into the bones of everything you've seen. Court favour doesn't replace other rivalries, it sharpens them, destabilizes them, and makes them feel urgent. And as you move forward, you sense the next battleground emerging, one that hides in plain sight, stitched into gowns and glimmering at throats. Fashion is about to speak. You don't need to look directly to know when fashion takes over. You feel eyes recalibrating, attention drifting downward and outward, scanning fabric, cut, colour, and weight. In this world, clothing isn't decoration, it's language. And Victorian duchesses are fluent, even when they pretend they're not. Especially then. You stand still and let the visual conversation wash over you because every stitch is saying something, often something sharp. A mainstream historical fact anchors the scene. Victorian fashion followed strict, ever-shifting rules tied to time of day, mourning status, marital position, and court protocol. Breaking these rules openly was risky, but bending them creatively was an art form. Duchesses used fashion to signal wealth, rank, taste, and, most dangerously, confidence. You're not just looking at gowns, you're reading statements. You notice one duchess wearing a shade just a fraction brighter than etiquette recommends for an afternoon visit. It's technically acceptable. Technically. The effect is immediate. Heads turn. Another duchess stiffens, clocking the move for what it is, a challenge wrapped in silk. You almost admire the restraint it takes not to comment. Silence here is acknowledgement. There's a quirky tidbit that makes you pause. Some Victorian fashion houses kept discreet records of their elite clients' rivalries, advising on designs that would help a duchess outshine specific competitors. This wasn't accidental glamour, it was targeted. Imagine commissioning a gown not to look beautiful, but to look more beautiful than one very specific person sitting 10 feet away. Petty? Yes. Effective? Also yes. You watch as jewellery enters the equation. A necklace worn too early in the day signals audacity. Diamonds during mourning suggest defiance or desperation. Pearls imply restraint, lineage, moral solidity. One duchess opts for almost nothing, a deliberate austerity that reads as supreme confidence. Another layers jewels with strategic heaviness, reminding everyone she can afford to. Neither choice is neutral, both are loaded. Historians still argue whether Victorian women experienced fashion as a form of empowerment or constraint. Standing here, you realize it's both, again. The rules cage them, but mastery of the rules creates room to maneuver. Duchesses learn exactly how far they can push before it becomes scandal rather than statement. And pushing, you see, is half the fun. You catch a whispered comment about sleeves. Sleeves, apparently they're too elaborate for the occasion. The judgment lands softly, but you can feel its weight. Fashion critique here isn't about taste, it's about character. Too extravagant suggests insecurity, too plain suggests decline. There is no safe middle ground, only constant calibration. A light joke slips into your thoughts as you realize Victorian Duchesses invented the concept of "you wore that?" without ever saying the words. The look alone does the work. You suppress a smile and immediately feel like you've committed a social faux pas just by enjoying it. Fashion rivalry extends beyond the individual. You notice how entire households participate. Maids adjust hems with military precision. Footmen hover with shawls timed perfectly for entrances. A well-executed appearance is a team effort, and failure reflects on everyone. One duchess arrives slightly late, ensuring all eyes are on her. Another arrives precisely on time, signaling discipline and moral uprightness. Both are statements. Both are critiques of the other. Another mainstream fact deepens the tension. Clothing was one of the few socially acceptable ways for aristocratic women to express individuality publicly. Writing, politics, open ambition, those were constrained. But a gown could speak volumes without technically saying anything at all. Rival duchesses understood this and listened closely. You overhear a comment about a dress being Parisian. It sounds complimentary. It isn't entirely. Paris implies fashion-forward, yes, but also foreign influence, frivolity, moral looseness, depending on who's listening. The Duchess being discussed smiles graciously, knowing exactly which interpretation is circulating and trusting her allies to hear the right one. Another light joke drifts in. This is basically a runway show where the judges are also contestants, and the prize is long-term social dominance. No eliminations, just slow fades into irrelevance. You shudder slightly. You notice how fashion becomes especially vicious among duchesses of similar rank. When titles don't settle the hierarchy, aesthetics try to. Who sets trends? Who follows? Who dares first? A duchess who successfully introduces a new silhouette or color palette gains intangible authority. Others imitate carefully, never too quickly. Too fast looks desperate. Too slow looks out of touch. Historians still argue whether fashion rivalry was consciously strategic or simply an outgrowth of taste and competition. Watching one duchess change her usual style after a rival receives praise, you strongly suspect consciousness had a lot to do with it. Adaptation here is survival. You feel the cruelty peak when fashion is used to isolate. A group of duchesses coordinate informally, colors, themes, levels of formality, without explicitly including another woman. She arrives dressed perfectly for the wrong context. The mistake isn't obvious to outsiders, but insiders notice instantly. The exclusion is elegant, devastating, and deniable. You feel a knot form in your stomach. This is not accidental. Another mainstream fact grounds the moment. Victorian etiquette manuals emphasized harmony and propriety, discouraging overt competition among women. Fashion rivalry thrived precisely because it could hide beneath those ideals. You're witnessing conflict that leaves no fingerprints. A final light joke flickers, softer now. Imagine spending hours laced into a corset just to emotionally annihilate someone with a hemline. Dedication like that deserves recognition, if not forgiveness. As the gathering draws toward its end, you realize how exhausting this battlefield is. Every glance, every fabric choice, every accessory must be weighed against dozens of invisible expectations and rival reactions. Duchesses don't just get dressed, they prepare arguments. You step back and understand something essential. Fashion here isn't vanity, it's diplomacy, insult, defense, and declaration all at once. And as you move forward, you sense that the next arena will look gentler on the surface. Kindness, even, but will cut just as deeply. Because charity, you're about to learn, can be cruel. You almost relax when the conversation turns to charity, because on the surface it sounds gentle, even soothing. Schools, hospitals, relief funds. Surely this is where rivalry softens into shared purpose. But you've been here long enough to know better. In Victorian society, charity is not just kindness. It's performance, influence, and comparison, wrapped in moral language. You lean in, already sensing the claws beneath the gloves. A mainstream historical fact anchors you. Aristocratic women, including duchesses, were heavily involved in philanthropic work during the Victorian era, often leading charitable societies and fundraising efforts. This was considered an appropriate extension of their moral role, allowing them public visibility without overtly challenging gender norms. Charity wasn't optional, it was expected, and expectation breeds competition. You notice how donations are discussed without numbers ever being spoken. Most generous, so committed, tireless in her efforts. These phrases float through the room, coded signals everyone understands. One duchess is praised for her personal involvement. She visits the poor herself. Another is admired for scale. She funds entire institutions. The rivalry isn't about helping, it's about how help is seen. There's a quirky tidbit that makes this feel especially sharp. Some Victorian charitable committees kept detailed records of donors and patrons, and while these lists were technically private, information travelled fast. A duchess who failed to contribute sufficiently, or worse, withdrew support, could find her moral reputation quietly questioned. Charity might save souls, but it also kept score. You feel the tension rise as one duchess announces a new initiative. It's ambitious, expensive, well-timed. The room reacts instantly. Admiration, yes, but also calculation. Can others match this? Should they try, or should they subtly undermine it? You sense resentment coil like smoke. Outdoing someone in charity creates an impossible standard for everyone else. Generosity becomes a burden imposed on rivals. Historians still argue whether Victorian philanthropy genuinely improved social conditions or primarily reinforced class hierarchy. Watching duchesses weaponize benevolence, you suspect it did both, helping some while humbling others. The poor receive aid, the rich receive validation, the rival duchess receives anxiety. A light joke slips through your thoughts as you realize this is the original virtue signaling, except the signals involve entire orphanages. You immediately regret the term, then accept that it fits uncomfortably well. You notice how charity becomes a safe way to criticize. One duchess expresses concern that another's project is perhaps a bit indulgent in charity. The implication hangs heavy: self-promotion, inefficiency, misplaced priorities. The target smiles serenely, knowing that defending oneself too strongly would look defensive and uncharitable. It's a trap with lace trim. Another mainstream fact sharpens the picture. Many Victorian charities were closely linked to religious movements, adding another layer of judgment. Supporting the wrong cause could mark a duchess as morally suspect or politically naive. Rival duchesses paid close attention to which charities others endorsed, reading alignment and ideology into every choice. You overhear whispered speculation about motives. Is she doing this for the children or for the headlines? The answer doesn't actually matter. The suspicion alone is damaging. Charity that looks too polished invites cynicism. Charity that looks too messy invites doubt about competence. There is no winning, only constant adjustment. Another light joke surfaces, softer but pointed. Victorian duchesses could turn feeding the hungry into an arms race. First, one funds soup kitchens, the next builds an entire hospital wing. Somewhere, someone's accountant is quietly crying. You begin to see how charity creates hierarchies among women who are otherwise equals. A duchess with a flagship cause becomes morally untouchable. Criticizing her risks looking cruel. Others orbit carefully, offering support without overshadowing. The imbalance breeds resentment, especially when moral authority translates into social influence. Historians still argue whether women found genuine fulfillment in philanthropic leadership or whether it primarily served as an acceptable outlet for ambition. Watching a duchess command a committee with military precision, you suspect fulfillment and ambition aren't mutually exclusive. But ambition here must wear a halo. You feel the cruelty peak when charity is used to isolate. A duchess is excluded from a committee under the guise of streamlining. No accusation is made, no insult spoken. But the message is clear. Her moral leadership is no longer required. In this society, that's a public demotion. Another mainstream fact grounds the emotional toll. Public reputation was central to aristocratic identity, especially for women whose influence depended on perception rather than formal power. Charity offered visibility, but also vulnerability. Fail once, or appear selfish, and whispers follow you everywhere. As the evening winds down, you feel the familiar exhaustion return. Even kindness here is strategic, weighed against rivals, adjusted for optics. Duchesses don't just give, they curate generosity, knowing it can elevate or destroy them. You step back with a quieter understanding now. In this world, charity isn't the absence of rivalry, it's one of its most refined expressions, and as you move forward, you sense the next weapon waiting to be unsheathed, lighter than money, sharper than fashion. Words. Whispers. Carefully placed scandal. You feel the shift before anyone raises their voice because scandal never announces itself loudly at first. It arrives as a pause, a glance, a sentence that trails off just early enough to invite curiosity. Words become lighter here, almost playful, but their impact grows heavier with every repetition. You lean closer because this is where rivalries sharpen into something truly dangerous: rumour, suggestion, and the art of saying just enough. A mainstream historical fact anchors you immediately. Victorian society was intensely concerned with reputation, especially for women, whose social standing depended heavily on perceived morality. Scandal could destroy a woman's influence without any formal accusation ever being made. Proof was optional. Suspicion was sufficient. Duchesses knew this, and some learned to use it with terrifying precision. You notice how gossip is framed as concern. I only mention it because I care. One worries, of course. These phrases drift through the room like perfume, pleasant at first, then cloying. A duchess doesn't accuse another directly, that would be crude. She wonders aloud. She expresses mild confusion. She allows others to connect the dots. You realize quickly that the most effective rumours here are never complete. Gaps do the damage. There's a quirky tidbit that makes you pause. Handwritten letters were often the vehicle for discreet scandal spreading, carefully phrased to be ambiguous if intercepted. A single line, you may have heard, could set off weeks of speculation. Imagine weaponized vagueness traveling by post, sealed with wax and plausible deniability. Slow, yes, but relentless. You watch as one duchess becomes the subject of unusually attentive concern. People ask after her health. Her absences are noted. Someone remarks that she seems tired. Another mentions seeing her husband alone more often. None of this is overtly malicious. All of it is devastating. You feel a chill as you realize how easily narrative replaces reality. Historians still argue whether Victorian gossip functioned primarily as social regulation or personal aggression. Standing here, you suspect it was both, discipline for deviation and opportunity for rivalry. When rules are rigid, rumour becomes enforcement. A light joke slips into your thoughts, dark and fleeting. Victorian Duchesses invented the soft launch of character assassination. No hard evidence, just vibes and raised eyebrows. You immediately feel bad for laughing, which somehow makes it funnier. You notice how quickly scandal aligns with existing rivalries. A duchess already disliked for her wealth, her accent, or her ambition becomes an easy target. Gossip sticks where resentment already lives. Others nod thoughtfully, not because they believe the story, but because it's convenient. Truth is optional. Utility is not. Another mainstream fact deepens the danger. Divorce and public separation were rare and scandalous, but rumours of marital discord alone could undermine a duchess's authority. A woman perceived as unable to manage her household lost credibility everywhere else. Rival duchesses understood this intimately. A whisper about domestic instability could quietly undo years of careful positioning. You overhear speculation framed as empathy. It must be difficult. Difficult. The word does so much work. It invites pity, but also judgment. You realize that once pity enters the equation, respect often slips out the back door. Another light joke surfaces, uneasy but accurate. This is basically a group chat where screenshots don't exist, but everyone remembers everything forever. You shiver slightly. You watch how duchesses protect themselves too. Strategic transparency, carefully staged appearances, invitations extended just widely enough to signal stability, smiles held a fraction longer. Scandal doesn't just attack, it forces defensive choreography. Even innocence must be performed convincingly. Historians still argue whether women were more vulnerable to scandal than men in Victorian aristocracy, or whether they simply bore its consequences more publicly. Watching a duchess's reputation fray under nothing more than implication, you sense the answer is both obvious and infuriating. You notice how gossip rarely originates from nowhere. Servants overhear, letters are misread. A private grief becomes public curiosity. Rival duchesses don't always invent scandal, they amplify it. They decide which whispers deserve oxygen and which suffocate quietly. Power here is editorial. Another mainstream fact grounds the cruelty. Victorian newspapers increasingly reported on aristocratic lives, blurring the line between private conduct and public interest. Even the hint of scandal could leak beyond drawing rooms into print. Once that happened, control vanished. Duchesses feared this escalation more than almost anything. You feel the exhaustion of it settle deep, to be constantly watched, interpreted, and discussed without ever being directly confronted, to defend yourself against sentences that never quite finish. This is rivalry at its most insidious, not loud, not dramatic, but corrosive. As the evening fades, you realize something unsettling. Scandal doesn't need truth to function. It only needs repetition and the right audience, and in a society obsessed with moral display, even the most respectable woman can be undone by the suggestion that something, anything, is slightly off. You step back, aware now that whispers are rarely the end, they're preparation, and as you move forward you sense the next layer waiting, quieter but no less powerful, moving invisibly between floors and corridors. Because someone has to carry these stories. And servants hear everything. You don't descend the stairs so much as slip between worlds. Above, voices are measured, words chosen like porcelain. Below, everything loosens. Footsteps echo, doors creak, breath is released. And here, in the half-lit corridors and servants' halls, you discover the nervous system of Victorian aristocratic life. If duchesses fight with glances and silences, servants are the wires that carry the current. A mainstream historical fact grounds you immediately. Large aristocratic households in Victorian Britain employed dozens of servants, many of whom lived on site and observed intimate details of their employers' lives. Maids, dressed duchesses, handled their letters, overheard their conversations, and witnessed moments never meant for public eyes. Privacy for the upper classes was always partial. You begin to understand why duchesses tread so carefully. A lady's maid knows which letters arrive too frequently. A footman notices which guest lingers too long. A cook hears arguments carried down stairwells late at night. None of this is malicious by default, but information moves. It always does. You feel the quiet danger of it, the way knowledge leaks, not through malice, but through proximity. There's a quirky tidbit that adds a strange intimacy. Some duchesses developed unusually close relationships with their personal maids, relying on them as confidants, stylists, and emotional buffers. These bonds could last decades. They could also shatter reputations. Trust here is practical, not sentimental. A maid knows when loyalty is safer than honesty and when it isn't. You notice how rivalries subtly exploit this network. A duchess doesn't spread a rumor herself. She lets a frustration slip while being dressed. She sighs a little too heavily while a maid pins a brooch. She asks an innocent question about another household. It doesn't sound like strategy. It doesn't need to. Servants talk among themselves, across households, across town. By the time a whisper resurfaces upstairs, it seems to have come from nowhere. Historians still argue whether servants were passive conduits of gossip or active agents shaping aristocratic narratives. Watching the careful way information moves here, selectively, unevenly, you suspect agency varied. Some servants were fiercely loyal, others were pragmatic, a few were quietly vengeful. All were observant. A light joke drifts through your mind, subdued but sharp. Victorian duchesses thought they were playing chess with each other, but the board was being quietly narrated by people in aprons. You almost smile, then remember the stakes. You sense the fear this knowledge creates. A duchess who mistreats her staff risks more than moral judgment. She risks exposure. Small kindnesses are remembered. So are humiliations. A slammed door, a harsh word, an unpaid wage, these echo. Servants might not confront power, but they remember it. Memory is leverage. Another mainstream fact deepens the tension. Domestic service was one of the largest sources of employment in Victorian Britain, and servants often moved between households carrying experience and stories with them. Loyalty wasn't permanent. Employment was fluid. Information travelled with the help. You overhear quiet speculation among servants about which household feels safe, which mistress is kind, which one is sharp-tongued when no guests are present. These assessments shape reputations just as surely as drawing-room whispers. You realise that social survival isn't just managed among equals, it's negotiated downward too. Another light joke slips in, gentler this time. If walls could talk, Victorian estates would never stop. But since walls can't, servants do the job instead. You see how duchesses attempt to manage this invisible battlefield, carefully worded instructions, controlled emotional displays, strategic generosity. Loyalty is cultivated like any other resource. But it's never guaranteed. Servants are human. They feel sympathy. They feel resentment. They choose what to repeat. Historians still argue whether servants' gossip undermined aristocratic authority or reinforced it by keeping behaviour in check. Standing here, you sense both truths coexisting. Fear of being talked about enforces restraint. Fear of silence enforces performance. You notice how scandal, once whispered upstairs, gains texture below. Details are added, timelines refined, contradictions smoothed out. By the time information resurfaces, it feels complete, even if it isn't true. You feel a quiet chill. Control, once lost, is rarely regained. Another mainstream fact anchors the emotional cost. Servants were expected to be discreet, but discretion was defined by employers, not by law. Dismissal could be sudden, devastating, and unjust. This imbalance made information powerful. Sometimes it was currency. Sometimes it was insurance. As you move back toward the stairs, you realize how much of the Duchesses' rivalry depends on people they rarely acknowledge as equals. Power flows downward, but knowledge flows sideways and up. That imbalance creates friction. And friction here creates sparks. You step back into the lamplight upstairs, carrying the uneasy awareness that every secret you thought was contained has already travelled farther than you imagined. And as you move forward, you sense the next threat waiting, not whispered, not worn, but carried in the body itself. Because health, fertility, and fear are about to take centre stage. You don't notice the fear at first because it wears such polite disguises, concern, sympathy, prayerful tones, but once you feel it, it's everywhere, threading through conversations like a draft through an old house. Health has entered the room, and with it, the most intimate rivalry of all. The kind fought inside bodies behind closed doors, with consequences no etiquette can soften. A mainstream historical fact anchors you firmly. Victorian medicine was limited, especially regarding women's health, fertility, and mental well-being. Childbirth remained dangerous, miscarriages were common, and many conditions were poorly understood or entirely misdiagnosed. For duchesses, whose value was often measured in heirs and endurance, illness was not just personal, it was political. You notice how quickly a cough becomes noteworthy, a faintness, a longer absence than usual. These details are tracked quietly by other duchesses, not always cruelly, but always attentively. One woman's weakness shifts the balance for everyone else. You feel the tension tighten when someone asks, a little too gently, whether another has been quite herself lately. It sounds caring. It lands like a probe. There's a quirky tidbit that adds a shiver. Some Victorian women were prescribed rest cures that involved isolation, forced inactivity, and removal from social life. While framed as treatment, these cures often sidelined women at critical moments. For a duchess, disappearing, even for health, could mean losing momentum permanently. Recovery was not guaranteed. Relevance was even less so. You sense how fertility sharpens rivalry instantly. A duchess who produces heirs quickly gains an aura of security. Others feel it immediately, even if they never say it. Compliments turn brittle. Praise sounds forced. You overhear someone remark that children come when one least expects them, a sentence that feels like a small knife wrapped in lace. Historians still argue whether the pressure on aristocratic women to produce heirs was primarily cultural or structural. Watching the way glances linger on women without children, you suspect the distinction barely matters. Pressure is pressure when it's constant. You feel the cruelty peak when illness becomes comparison. One duchess is praised for her fortitude, how she carried on despite difficulty. Another is pitied for delicacy. The difference between admiration and dismissal is razor-thin. Strength is moralized. Weakness is remembered. You realize how exhausting it must be to perform wellness in a body that refuses to cooperate. A light joke flickers through your thoughts, uneasy but real. Victorian society really said mind over matter, and then blamed women when matter won. You don't laugh out loud. No one here would. Another mainstream fact deepens the anxiety. Mental health struggles were often framed as moral or emotional failings rather than medical conditions. A duchess showing signs of depression, anxiety, or grief risked being labelled unstable. Rival duchesses noticed this instantly. Stability equaled authority. Instability invited exclusion. You overhear a whisper about nerves. The word does heavy lifting. It suggests fragility without proof. It spreads easily. You see how a woman once admired for sensitivity is slowly reframed as unreliable. The shift is subtle, almost elegant, and devastating. Historians still argue whether Victorian women found ways to resist these narratives or were entirely trapped by them. Watching a duchess maintain perfect composure while clearly unwell, you sense resistance in endurance, but also cost. Survival here often means silence. Another light joke slips in, gentler now. Imagine having to look radiant while surviving medical advice that includes leeches and enforced cheerfulness. The human body was doing its best. Society was not. You notice how fear spreads through comparison. A miscarriage in one household sends quiet tremors through others. A difficult birth becomes a cautionary tale. Bodies become battlegrounds of probability and dread. You feel the collective anxiety humming, unspoken but shared. Another mainstream fact grounds the emotional toll. Infant mortality rates remained high throughout much of the Victorian era, even among the wealthy. Loss was common, grief omnipresent, and public mourning tightly regulated. Duchesses were expected to absorb tragedy and return composed. Rivalries did not pause for grief. You see how compassion is rationed, sympathy offered once, twice, never indefinitely. Grief that lingers too long becomes inconvenient. Illness that doesn't resolve becomes awkward. Rival duchesses grow impatient not because they lack feeling, but because patience here has a social limit. Historians still argue whether the emotional restraint of Victorian culture protected women or harmed them. Watching a duchess smile through visible exhaustion, you feel the answer settle heavily. Protection that demands constant performance is no protection at all. As the evening thins, you feel the weight of it all press inward. Health is the one battlefield no one fully controls. And that makes it terrifying. Duchesses compete fiercely everywhere else because here, in flesh and blood, they are most vulnerable. You step back with a quiet understanding. Rivalry doesn't just live in rooms and reputations. It lives in fear of failing bodies, in the terror of not fulfilling expectations no one dares to question. And as you move forward, you sense the lens widening now, pulling these private anxieties into a much larger picture. Because empire, power, and global ambition are about to cast their long shadows right across the drawing room floor. You feel the room expand without anyone moving, as if the walls have quietly stretched to include places you've never seen. India, Africa, distant islands and ports whose names are spoken with confidence and very little understanding. Empire has slipped into the conversation, and suddenly the rivalries you've been watching feel both smaller and more dangerous, because now they're entangled with something vast, abstract, and brutally real. A mainstream historical fact steadies you. During the Victorian era, the British Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, shaping politics, wealth, and identity at home. Aristocratic families were deeply connected to imperial administration through colonial governorships, military commands, investments, and patronage. Duchesses, though far from battlefields, were not removed from empire. They were its social managers. You notice how casually imperial references appear: a husband's posting, a son's regiment, a charity focused on civilizing efforts abroad. These details function like social currency. A duchess whose family is visibly tied to imperial success gains prestige. Another, whose interests remain stubbornly domestic, feels suddenly provincial. You realize empire isn't just about land, it's about relevance. There's a quirky tidbit that feels unsettling in its normality. Some duchesses hosted elaborate themed events celebrating colonial cultures, filtered through exoticized fashion and decor. These gatherings signaled sophistication and global reach, but also reinforced hierarchies that placed Britain, and by extension its aristocracy, firmly at the centre. Rival duchesses noticed who could pull this off convincingly and who looked like they were trying too hard. You sense how empire reshapes rivalry by adding moral posturing to ambition. One duchess champions missionary work. Another supports colonial education initiatives. On the surface, it's benevolence. Underneath, it's positioning. Whose vision of empire is more enlightened, more modern, more aligned with progress? The arguments are polite, but the judgments are sharp. Historians still argue whether aristocratic women were complicit agents of empire or constrained participants in a system they did not control. Watching duchesses leverage imperial causes to elevate their moral authority, you suspect complicity came in quieter forms, through hosting, endorsing, and normalizing power rather than wielding it openly. A light joke drifts through your thoughts, uneasy but fitting. Victorian duchesses really said, think globally, compete locally. You don't laugh out loud. Empire has a way of flattening humour. You notice how imperial connections intensify existing tensions. A duchess whose husband holds a prestigious overseas post suddenly commands more attention. Others adjust quickly, praising sacrifice, admiring courage. Envy hums beneath the compliments. Distance becomes glamour. Absence becomes proof of importance. You feel the imbalance shift. Another mainstream fact deepens the dynamic. Imperial service was often financially risky, with fortunes made or lost abroad. Success elevated families dramatically. Failure could quietly ruin them. Duchesses learned to read imperial outcomes the same way they read court favour, carefully, opportunistically, and with long memory. You overhear speculation about a colonial scandal, mismanagement, harsh policies. Nothing is said directly, but implication hangs heavy. Empire creates distance, and distance creates ambiguity. Rival duchesses exploit that uncertainty expertly. A shadow abroad can darken a reputation at home without ever being named. Another light joke flickers, darker this time. It's wild how people will argue over moral superiority while benefiting from systems they never have to see up close. You immediately feel the weight of that truth settle uncomfortably. You sense how empire provides new language for old rivalries, civilization versus chaos, duty versus indulgence, progress versus decay. These aren't just political ideas, they're personal branding tools. A duchess aligns herself with the right version of empire and gains moral insulation. Criticism becomes harder. Rivals grow cautious. Historians still argue whether imperial ideology unified the aristocracy or deepened internal divisions. Watching duchesses quietly judge one another's causes and commitments, you realize division thrives even inside shared belief. Agreement on dominance doesn't prevent disagreement on how it should look. You feel the emotional distance empire creates. It allows cruelty to be abstract, competition to feel righteous, rivalries gain a sense of mission, a justification beyond personal gain. That makes them more durable and harder to question. Another mainstream fact grounds the human cost. Imperial expansion brought immense suffering to colonized peoples, though this reality was often obscured or minimized in polite Victorian society. Duchesses rarely spoke of that suffering directly. Silence here was also a choice. As the conversation drifts back to domestic matters, empire lingers like a shadow that doesn't quite leave. You understand now that these rivalries aren't isolated. They're fed by global power, justified by national pride, and cushioned by distance. You step back with a heavier awareness. What happens in drawing rooms echoes far beyond them, and as you move forward, you sense the focus narrowing again, pulling back from continents to confidences, because the most dangerous rivalries aren't always loud or ideological. Sometimes they wear the mask of friendship. You feel the shift immediately, even though nothing obvious changes. Voices soften, laughter lingers a fraction longer, hands touch sleeves, just briefly enough to suggest warmth. Friendship has entered the room, or at least the performance of it. And you already know this may be the most dangerous terrain yet. Rivalry between enemies is predictable. Rivalry between friends is surgical. A mainstream historical fact steadies you. Victorian society placed enormous value on female friendship, often idealizing it as morally uplifting and emotionally pure. Letters between women could be intimate, expressive, even passionate, without scandal. Friendship was encouraged, so long as it remained supportive, restrained, and non-threatening to family or hierarchy. That encouragement created cover, and cover creates opportunity. You watch two duchesses greet one another with genuine familiarity. They've known each other for years, shared seasons, shared losses, shared secrets. Their smiles are warm, but not careless. You sense calculation humming beneath affection, because friendship here doesn't erase competition, it reframes it. A rival you know well can hurt you far more precisely than one you don't. There's a quirky tidbit that adds an almost tender edge. Some Victorian women wrote daily letters to close female friends, chronicling emotions, anxieties, and social frustrations in detail. These letters could be lifelines or liabilities. A confidence shared in trust could become leverage if circumstances shifted. Ink, once dry, does not forget. You feel the ache of it when one duchess praises another just a little too publicly. The compliment feels real, but it also establishes hierarchy. Admiration offered too often can become patronizing. You see the recipient register this instantly, smile unchanged, posture subtly altered. Friendship doesn't eliminate power dynamics, it just hides them better. Historians still argue whether close female friendships provided genuine refuge from patriarchal pressure, or simply mirrored its competitive structures. Standing here, watching warmth coexist with vigilance, you suspect refuge and rivalry often shared the same space. Support does not preclude ambition. A light joke slips through your thoughts, bittersweet. Victorian besties really said "I love you" and "I'm watching you" in the same breath. You don't laugh. It feels too accurate. You notice how alliances form that look like friendship, but function like mutual defense agreements. Two duchesses present a united front, endorsing each other's causes, praising each other's daughters. It's sincere until it isn't. If one rises too fast, the balance strains. Equality is comfortable. Imbalance breeds quiet resentment. Another mainstream fact deepens the tension. Women's social influence often depended on networks rather than individual authority. Friendship networks could elevate voices or silence them. Inclusion mattered. Exclusion devastated. A falling out didn't need to be public. To be effective, it only needed to be felt. You overhear a conversation where one duchess gently discourages another from pursuing a particular opportunity. The advice sounds caring, protective, but you sense the hesitation beneath it. Is she safeguarding her friend or protecting her own position? The ambiguity is the point. Motives blur easily when affection is involved. Another light joke surfaces, softer and sadder. It's amazing how often "for your own good" translates to "please don't outshine me." You feel a small knot form in your chest. You see how friendship becomes a testing ground. Secrets shared are monitored for discretion. Support offered is weighed for reciprocity. A missed defense, failing to publicly support a friend during a slight, registers immediately. Loyalty here isn't declared. It's demonstrated in micro moments everyone remembers. Historians still argue whether women consciously weaponized friendship or simply adapted to scarcity of power. Watching a duchess gently withdraw emotional warmth without explanation, you sense adaptation more than malice. When resources are limited, even affection becomes strategic. You feel the cruelty peak when friendship fractures quietly. No argument, no confrontation, just distance, fewer invitations, slower replies. The loss is felt keenly because it can't be challenged without looking desperate. You understand now why some rivalries hurt more than others. Betrayal leaves a sharper echo than hostility ever could. Another mainstream fact grounds the emotional reality. Victorian etiquette discouraged overt conflict among women, especially friends. Resentment had to be expressed indirectly or not at all. Silence became language. Withdrawal became punishment. As the evening thins, you realize how heavy this is. To need friendship desperately while knowing it can turn, to offer warmth while guarding your flank, to love and compete in the same breath. Duchesses weren't cold because they lacked feeling. They were careful because feeling was risky. You step back with a quieter awareness. Not all rivalries announce themselves as opposition. Some begin with laughter, shared glances, and promises whispered in corners. And as you move forward, you sense the tension tightening again, not outward now, but inward. Because when restraint defines a culture, conflict doesn't disappear. It goes underground. You feel it before you can name it, the pressure that builds when nothing is allowed to be said outright. Victorian restraint doesn't eliminate conflict. It compresses it. Every rule, every expectation of composure, every demand for ladylike calm forces rivalry to burrow deeper, where it sharpens quietly. You're no longer watching open maneuvering. You're watching pressure seek an outlet. A mainstream historical fact anchors this tightening atmosphere. Victorian social norms prized self-control, emotional discipline, and outward harmony, particularly for women of rank. Displays of anger, jealousy, or ambition were considered unbecoming. For duchesses, whose value rested on grace and moral authority, visible conflict could be socially disastrous. So conflict adapted. You notice how hostility expresses itself through absence rather than presence. A name left off a guest list, a delay in responding to a letter, an introduction that never quite happens. These omissions are invisible to outsiders, but devastating to those inside the system. You realize how much damage can be done without anyone ever raising their voice. There's a quirky tidbit that makes this compression feel almost physical. Victorian etiquette manuals explicitly advised women to suppress strong emotions in public, framing emotional expression as a failure of character. Feelings didn't vanish, they went inward. Rivalry became internalized, turning into chronic anxiety, resentment, and hypervigilance. The battlefield moved inside the body. You sense how this restraint makes conflict more vicious, not less. When you can't confront someone directly, you plan, you wait, you remember. You store grievances like carefully labeled parcels, ready to be opened when opportunity finally presents itself. Duchesses learn patience not as a virtue, but as a weapon. Historians still argue whether Victorian emotional restraint protected social stability or caused long-term psychological harm. Watching a duchess maintain perfect composure while her rival is quietly elevated above her, you feel the cost. Stability for the system, perhaps. Strain for the individual. A light joke flickers through your mind, dry and tired. Victorian society really said calm down and then acted surprised when resentment fermented into something potent. You almost smile. Almost. You notice how restraint turns minor slights into obsessions. A seating change, a forgotten compliment, a delayed acknowledgement. With no outlet for expression, these moments grow in the imagination, replayed endlessly. Rivalries become self-sustaining, fed by memory rather than new offense. Another mainstream fact deepens the picture. Women had limited legal and economic independence, making social standing one of the few arenas where they could exert control. When that standing was threatened, the emotional stakes skyrocketed. Losing status wasn't just embarrassing, it was existential. You see how restraint encourages plausible deniability. A duchess can wound another deeply while maintaining absolute politeness. If confronted, she can appear shocked, wounded, innocent. "I had no idea," she might say, and technically that might even be true. Intent is slippery when everything is indirect. Another light joke surfaces darker now. This is emotional gaslighting, but with better posture and stricter dress codes. You don't laugh, it lands too close. Historians still argue whether indirect conflict was more damaging than open confrontation. Standing here, watching the cumulative weight of small exclusions pile up, you suspect it was. Open conflict ends, suppressed conflict lingers. You feel how this underground tension binds rivalries to time. Years pass, people age, titles change hands, but resentment remains intact, preserved by silence. A duchess may wait decades for the right moment to reassert herself, and when it comes, the strike feels almost accidental, almost kind. Another mainstream fact grounds the generational impact. Social patterns learned in one generation were often passed to the next through example rather than instruction. Daughters watched their mothers navigate slights and absorbed the methods. Rivalries outlived the women who began them. As the evening thins, the room feels quieter, not calmer, but heavier. You realize this is the most dangerous phase of all. Nothing looks wrong, everything appears orderly, and beneath it, hostility coils patiently, waiting for the smallest crack. You step back, sensing the end approaching. These rivalries don't explode, they echo, they fade slowly, leaving impressions rather than conclusions. And as you move forward, you feel the narrative loosening its grip, preparing to exhale. Because what remains now isn't drama or triumph, it's legacy. You don't notice the ending arrive so much as you feel the tension thin, like a long-held breath, finally easing out. The drawing room's empty, the seasons turn, faces age. Rivalries don't explode or resolve neatly, they dissolve into memory, reputation, and stories, told with just enough distortion to favor the teller. This is how Victorian duchesses ultimately win or lose, not in moments, but in echoes. A mainstream historical fact steadies you as you look back. Many Victorian aristocratic families preserved letters, diaries, and memoirs that shaped how later generations understood the past. These records weren't neutral. They reflected loyalties, resentments, and carefully curated self-images. Duchesses who never spoke openly in life often spoke very clearly on paper. Legacy, it turns out, could be edited. You begin to see how rivalry outlives its participants. A duchess remembered as difficult is often one who challenged expectations too visibly. Another remembered as beloved may simply have mastered restraint better. These reputations harden over time, becoming shorthand judgments passed down without context. You feel the quiet injustice of it, how personality is flattened into moral lesson. There's a quirky tidbit that feels almost tender. Some families deliberately destroyed letters or diaries before death, fearing misinterpretation. Silence, even at the end, was a form of control. You imagine a woman deciding which version of herself history is allowed to meet. It's the final act of rivalry, not against another duchess, but against time itself. Historians still argue whether Victorian women were victims of a system that constrained them or skilled navigators who shaped it from within. Standing at this distance, you realize both can be true. Constraint does not erase agency. Agency does not erase cost. The rivalries you followed weren't petty, they were adaptive responses to narrow corridors of power. You notice how these feuds ripple outward. Daughters inherit caution. Sons inherit grudges. Marriages are influenced by half-remembered slights. Even when names fade, patterns remain. Who is trusted? Who is avoided? Who is spoken of with a pause before the compliment? You understand now that rivalry doesn't need active participation to persist. It only needs memory. A light joke drifts through your thoughts, softer now. Victorian duchesses really said, "I'll be the bigger person," then made sure history noticed. You smile gently this time. Another mainstream fact grounds the closing mood. By the late Victorian period, social power was already shifting. Industrial wealth, political reform, and cultural change were eroding aristocratic dominance. Some rivalries lost their urgency as the world moved on. Others intensified, fueled by the fear of becoming irrelevant. Decline sharpens memory. You sense how restraint, once essential, becomes legacy's filter. The most visible conflicts are forgotten. The quiet ones endure. A duchess who never raised her voice may still shape how her rivals are remembered decades later. Silence, you realize, can be louder than action if it's sustained long enough. Historians still argue whether these aristocratic rivalries mattered beyond their own circles. Listening to their echoes, you feel the answer settle. They mattered because they reveal how power behaves when it's constrained, how it adapts, hides, and survives. They mattered because they shaped lives lived under constant observation, where even kindness could be strategic. You step back one final time and look at the whole arc. These women weren't monsters. They weren't saints. They were intelligent, pressured, observant, and deeply human, fighting for space in a system that demanded perfection while offering very little mercy. Their battles were quiet because they had to be. Their damage was subtle because subtlety was the rule. And now, as the room's empty and the candles burn low, the rivalries soften into something almost abstract. Lessons, warnings, whispers folded into history. Your breathing slows. The tension that once hummed through silk and stone fades into a distant murmur. The house grows still now, the kind of stillness that comes after a long day of watching, measuring, holding everything just so. You let the images blur gently, gowns dissolving into shadow, voices fading into memory, rivalries loosening their grip as time smooths their sharpest edges. These women fought quietly, because they had to, and when you think of them now, there's less judgment, more understanding. Power pressed them inward, and they learned to survive there. You don't need to carry their tension anymore. Let it stay in the past, resting among portraits and paper. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let your thoughts drift, slow and unguarded, into rest.